I don't know if you guys ever remember the old game show To Tell the Truth. Here's the logo up here behind me. But it was a pretty big game show back in the 20th century. And they actually rebooted it a couple of years ago. I don't know if anybody saw that. We don't have that kind of shared experience like we used to, and you only had 3 channels on the television and you had to watch something. Now people are watching a million different things. But if you're young, there is a YouTube channel called Jubilee, which also does something very similar to what the game show To Tell the Truth did. So the idea is that you have a panel, right? And there's got a panel of these 3 people, and each one of them walks out and they claim to be something. So they claim to be an astronaut. And one of them is telling the truth. The other 2 are telling you lies. And so the contestant or the celebrity panel or whoever it is has to ask questions of these 3 individuals and try to find out which one of them happens to be the real deal. Okay, so some recent episodes that were kind of interesting. One was a real-life ninja. One of the 3 was a real-life ninja. One was the jump rope champion of the world. Again, I don't know what the qualifications are for the jump rope champion of the world, but it was an interesting episode. One of them was a blind man who climbed all 7 of the world's tallest peaks. Another one was the sergeant who led the police pursuit of O.J. Simpson's white Bronco, that we all watched live on TV. And so they'd have 3 people. Well, I'm the sergeant. And the next person, no, I'm the sergeant. And the third person, no, it was me. And then you get to ask them questions and try to find out who's the real deal. Who really was the sergeant that chased down O.J. Simpson? Because only one of them was the real deal. So we're going to look at the trials of Jesus this morning, and we're going to see a whole bunch of political power, some big-time firepower here. We're going to see the leaders of the Jewish people. We're going to see a guy by the name of Annas. You guys, we actually talked about Annas last week. Jason brought him up. But he's a very interesting character. He was a former high priest, but he was still the real power behind the scenes. He had successfully got 5 of his sons also installed as high priest after him. And the guy who is currently high priest, Caiaphas, was married to his daughter, was his son-in-law. So it seems like Caiaphas would be the one that has the power, and he did, of course, have a lot of power as the reigning high priest. But Annas was this kind of puppet master behind the scenes. We see the Jewish Sanhedrin, 70 elders who were responsible for the religious and civil life of the nation. And of course, we can't forget the person that we're going to see most often here is the Roman procurator named Pontius Pilate, who of course represented the Roman Caesar at the time. So there's a lot of firepower here. There's a lot of people saying that politically, they're the ones who are in control. They're the ones that have the power. They're the ones that get to say what happens here. But as the story unfolds, what we're going to see is the irony is that the real king is Jesus. The real king is the one who is on the trial. He is the one that at any point could walk away from this. We're told that while he was on the cross, he could have gotten down if he so chose. But that's not what he came to do. He came into this world for the very purpose of this trial. He came into this world for the crucifixion that's going to follow, so that he could defeat sin once and for all, pay the price for your sin and my sin, so that we could have a right relationship with God. He came to 3 days later rise again on that first Easter Sunday morning, breaking the chains of death, so that you and I don't have to fear death. For us, death is a temporary thing where we will be resurrected and we will be with our Lord forever. Jesus was the one in power the whole time. Jesus was the real king. And so throughout this trial and the crucifixion that we're going to look at next week and even into the resurrection, what John wants you and I to do is to keep our eyes on the big picture. We could get bogged down in the details. We could think about how terrible some of these stories and situations are, and they are. But keep our eyes on the prize. Keep our eyes on what Jesus was here for. He was here to save the world. For God, what? So loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, so that whoever believes in him might not perish, but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to... That's the big picture. And let's keep that in our minds as we continue to look through these trials of Jesus. When you don't keep your eyes on the big picture, you can get into a lot of trouble. I was at work the other day, and I was walking down a hallway that I've walked down 1,000,000 times before in my life, and just happened to get a text message on my phone. And so I reached in my pocket, and I grabbed my phone, and I guess I didn't have enough time to take the minute and 30 seconds to get where I was going and look at the text. I had to do it while I was walking. And I saw it was a message, and I was like, I got to reply to this. I can't wait the minute to get to where I'm supposed to go. So I started typing on my phone. So I'm just walking down like this. And I didn't notice that I was a little bit like 3 feet spatially off from where I normally am. And so, bam, I ran smack into a wall and fell down on the ground. And unfortunately, there were people present. Man, I think I told you the story how I fell up the stairs last time. You guys are going to think I'm really clumsy, but I guess I am. But there are a bunch of people around, and I could tell, I could look in their eyes. They're thinking, how did that guy just fall on the ground and hit the wall? And the reason why is because I didn't have my focus in the right place. I was focused myopically on my phone rather than taking in the big picture. My dad, when he taught me to drive, the car I learned to drive on was a K car. I don't know if you guys remember the Red Green show where he had a K car and he literally took 2 fronts of it and put them together and it looked the same as a K car because it's that boxy. Like if you're like a 3-year-old kid and you draw a car, you draw a K car. So it was an old 87 Plymouth Reliant. And I remember getting into it my first time, and I looked over at my dad, and I'm like, how do I keep this between the yellow and the white line? How do I make sure I'm not going to hit anybody or anything? And so he gave me this trick. He says, okay, look at the front left edge of the hood and line it up with the yellow line, and then you will be going down the lane perfectly. And so for like the first month that I drove, that's how I drove, was looking down at the yellow line. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that's a dangerous thing to do. So when I started having actual driver's lessons with an actual driving instructor, he quickly noticed that I was looking at the yellow line and not looking at the road. And this is what he said, "What are you doing, son? You got to keep your eyes up." And I still remember that to this day. Like, yeah, you got to keep your eyes up or you could get in a lot of trouble. And it's the same thing with us. These are some amazing stories that we're going to be looking at. Are they not fun to read sometimes? Yes. We're going to be talking about the trials of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus. But if we keep our eyes on why Jesus was there, this is the whole point he came into the world. The whole point was so that he could give himself for our sins, so he could carry the weight of our sin on the cross so that we could have a right relationship with God. Jesus is the story. Jesus is the true king. And if you're a king, you have a kingdom, right? So what is Jesus' kingdom? Jesus' kingdom in our part of the story, right now, in the church age, is us. We are the kingdom of God. The people who have put our faith in Jesus, he reigns from the right hand of the Father while he waits for all of his enemies to be completely brought under his feet. And the enemies that God came to save us from are not political enemies. They're not kings. They're not nations. The enemies that Jesus came to save us from are far bigger than that. They are sin, which separates us from God. They are death, and they are Satan. These are the things that Jesus is triumphing over through his work. But his disciples, they don't get it. They don't see it because they've been taught their whole life that the kingdom of God is a political kingdom. They've been taught their whole life that one day there would be this anointed one who would come, this Messiah who would come, and he would beat back whoever was oppressing them in the moment, that he would liberate their land, that he would give them the land that was promised to their ancestor Abraham, and that they would be able to live in it with peace and be able to worship their God. So when they thought of the kingdom of God, they thought in terms of a political kingdom with an earthly king, with a border, and with an army, so that they could protect themselves. They were looking for a new Joshua. But Jesus had far grander things in mind for his kingdom. He wanted a worldwide kingdom that spanned the entirety of the globe in the hearts of the people who were following after him. That's the big picture. So we see some people who get it wrong. Judas is one of them. Okay, so Judas is different than the disciples, not just because he betrayed Jesus, but because he was from a completely different place. We call him Judas Iscariot, right, to distinguish him from another one of the 12 who's also named Judas. Judas Iscariot means Judas from Iscarioth, which was a town that was south of Jerusalem. Okay, so Jesus and the rest of the disciples were all from Galilee, which was way up north by the Lake of Galilee. Judas was from far south, over 100 miles away. So Jesus happened upon the other disciples happened upon Jesus. They lived in the same area. Judas, and this is conjecture, so Aaron's opinion, Judas traveled there. And it could be he just was a transplant, but it also could be that he had heard about Jesus. And he thought, perhaps this is the political revolutionary that we have been waiting for. And he traveled there just to be part of his band of followers. But I don't think it took Judas very long to realize that Jesus was not the kind of Messiah that he was after. And so, of course, we learn earlier on in the Gospel of John that he began to steal, from the money that they had for their little band of followers there. Then we learn, of course, in the passage that Jason looked at, we learned that he betrayed them for 30 pieces of silver. He didn't get it. He didn't understand why Jesus was there. He didn't see the big picture. Now, we could look at Peter and we could say the same thing about him. Of course, he didn't betray Jesus, but he also didn't quite understand. There's one point in the ministry of Jesus where he asked his disciples, as you're out and about, who do people say that I am? And a lot of them had to do with being a prophet. Well, some say you're Moses. Some say you're Elijah. Some say you're a prophet. Some people say you're the prophet, the one that Moses predicted would come and who would be like him. But then Jesus makes it a little bit more personal. Who do you say? Who do you say that I am? And of course, Peter, he jumps up. He's always the one to answer first, right? And he says, well, I believe that you are the Christ. Okay, Christ is the Greek word for the anointed one. I believe you are the Messiah. Messiah is the Hebrew word for the anointed one, God's anointed one. And Jesus agrees with Peter, yes, I am the Messiah, but I'm not the Messiah that you're thinking of. I'm not a political revolutionary who's going to throw off Rome. I got far bigger plans than that. And so Jesus begins to explain to the disciples at that point that he is going to suffer and he's going to die for the sins of the world. At this point, what does Peter do? Does Peter say, gotcha. Now I know you're the Messiah. And now I know this is the kind of Messiah you are. You're a suffering, serving Messiah. No, Peter grabs a hold of Jesus' elbow. Can you imagine doing this? And pulls him aside one-on-one. And he says, I think you got this wrong. This is not the job of the Messiah. So how does Jesus react to that? Strongly. This is what he says. Get behind me, Satan. You don't have in your mind the things of God. You have in your mind the things of man. And this is very important as we look at these trials. What is the things of man? Political independence, taking over the nation, fighting, force. What's the way of Jesus? The way of Jesus is serving and sacrificing and building a worldwide kingdom of God. And so the same thing happened in the passage last week with Peter too. Remember when they came to arrest Jesus, what does Peter do? Grabs a hold of his sword, cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest, Malchus. And what does Jesus say? Good, good, good. Let's go. No, he rebukes Peter, not the people arresting him. He rebukes Peter. Says, you're not thinking correctly. This is not the plan. This is not why I am here. And so he heals the servant and he rebukes Peter once again. And so he's going to reiterate this very same thing when we get to what he says to Pilate here in just a moment. If his kingdom were a worldly kingdom, a nation with borders and a king and an army, then his followers would fight. But his kingdom is a spiritual kingdom. He came to defeat far greater enemies than Rome. He came to defeat sin, death, and the devil, all through his service and sacrifice for the sins of the world. God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save his world. That's why Jesus is here. All right, so we're going to read these verses, and it's going to take me a little bit. But I wanted to put up here an outline. Aaron, what is a chiasm? I'm glad you asked. All right, so chiasm is just a way of telling a story. Okay, so we do that in our world today. Like, you can tell that there are certain different ways you tell stories, like a fairy tale. How does a fairy tale start? Once upon a time in a land far, far away. How does it end? They all lived. Okay, so there's a way to tell a fairy tale, and you're like, oh, that's a fairy tale. Okay, and it's the same thing. You can use different ways to tell a story in order to make certain points. And what we have here is something called a chiasm. And the idea is you say something at the beginning, and then you kind of reiterate that at the end. You say something second, and you reiterate that second to the end. And what it does is it builds up into the climax, which happens to be what happens in the middle of the story. Okay, so like if you look at the entire book of Esther, the entire book of Esther is a chiasm. And at the center is Esther's decision that she's going to save her people. And so we see that, I think, here. Now, I think some scholars get chiasm happy, and they see them everywhere. But I do think there is one here. And you can see what's in the middle. What's John trying to draw our attention to as he tells the story of the trials? He's trying to see this mock coronation of Jesus, where Jesus is crowned and Jesus is hailed as king and clothed in a royal robe. And the irony here is that while they were mocking him as king, we know that he is the real king. Will the real king please stand up? The real king is Jesus. So I'm just going to leave this up here as we kind of talk about this, and you can kind of follow it along as I read. All right, so this is chapter 18, if you want to turn there, and it starts in verse 28. So they brought Jesus from Caiaphas to the Roman governor's residence. Now it was very early in the morning. And they did not go into the governor's residence so that they would not be ceremonially defiled, but could eat the Passover meal. So Pilate came outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They replied, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Well, Pilate told them, "Well, then take him yourself and pass judgment on him yourself according to your own laws." And the Jewish leaders replied, "We cannot legally put anybody to death." This happened to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken when he indicated what type of death he was going to die. And so Pilate went back into the governor's residence, summoned Jesus, and he asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus replied, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or have other people told you about me?" Pilate answered, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your people, your chief priests, handed you over to me. So what have you done?" Jesus replied, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my servants would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish authorities. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Then Pilate said, "So you are a king then?" And Jesus replied, "You say that I'm a king. For this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked, "What is truth?" When he had said this, he went back outside to the Jewish leaders, and he announced, "I find no basis for an accusation against him. But it is your custom that I release one prisoner for you at Passover. So do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" So Jesus. And then he shouted back, "Not this man. We want Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a revolutionary. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged severely. The soldiers braided a crown of thorns, and they put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe, and they came up to him again and again, and they said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him repeatedly in the face. Again, Pilate went out, and he said to the Jewish leaders, "Look, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know I find no reason for any accusation against him." So Jesus came outside, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Look, here is the man." When the chief priests and their officers saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said, "You take him and crucify him. Certainly I find no reason for any accusation against him." And the Jewish leaders replied, "We have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die because he has claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard what they said, he was more afraid than he had ever been. And he went back into the governor's residence, and he said to Jesus, "Where is it that you come from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. And so Pilate said, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know I have the authority to release you or to crucify you?" Jesus replied, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it was given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin." From this point on, Pilate tried to release Jesus, But the Jewish leaders shouted out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the Caesar. Everyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." And when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat him down on the judgment seat in a place called the Stone Pavement. Now it was the day of preparation for Passover, about noon. And Pilate said to the Jewish leaders, "Look, here is your king." And then they shouted, away with him, crucify him." And Pilate asked, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the high priest replied, "We have no king but Caesar." And then Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So I think the emphasis is squarely here on Jesus being mocked as king. But the irony is that he is the real king all along. The Jewish leaders, the Roman soldiers, they're all mocking him. But we know his real identity. Will the real king please stand up? That real king was not Pilate. That real king was not Annas. That real king was not Caiaphas, nor was it Herod Antipas. That real king is Jesus. He even says to Pilate, "You don't have any authority except what's been given to you by me. I am the one who is in charge here, not you." Because Jesus' crucifixion was going to lead to the final defeat of sin. He was there on purpose. And so Jesus put on trial. All right, in the other Gospels, we see that he appeared before Herod Antipas. We see that he appeared before the high priest Caiaphas. John kind of skips over that. But clearly, what they are upset about is blasphemy. They believe that Jesus is claiming to be God, which he was. They believe that Jesus was not God, which makes it blasphemy. And according to them, that should be followed up with execution. Unfortunately for them, they did not have that kind of power because Rome was in charge. They couldn't just execute somebody, especially for a theological crime. So they have to try to get Rome on board. But how do you get Rome on board with a theological crime? How do you go up to Pontius Pilate and say, "Well, this guy's claiming to be God, so you need to put him to death"? What does Pilate care about that? It's a theological disagreement. So they have to come up with a different charge. So when they finally bring him before Pilate, the charge that they bring is this guy is claiming to be king. Caesar's king, right? So if he's claiming to be king, that's insurrection. He's trying to overthrow you. Now, Rome might be a little bit more interested in the charge, right? Well, wait a second. Is this guy claiming to be king? So Jesus is brought before Pilate, and Pilate asks him point blank, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus doesn't just answer with a yes, "I'm the king of the Jews," but he does answer with a yes, right? He says, "Yeah, I have a kingdom, and my kingdom is not of this world," right? Only kings have kingdoms. So Jesus does not deny the fact that he's a king. In fact, he verifies that's exactly who he was. But it's the same kind of thing with Peter earlier in the Gospels. Peter says, "Well, I believe that you're the Messiah." And then Jesus has to explain, "Well, this is the kind of Messiah I am." He says to Pilate here, "Yeah, I am a king, but let me tell you what kind of king I am. I'm not a king that's come here to overthrow Caesar. I am a king that's got far greater purpose in mind than that. My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world and it was a political entity, then my followers would fight to prevent my arrest. But my kingdom is from another place. It's a heavenly kingdom." Now, Pilate wants to be very sure. So he says again, "Are you sure? Are you a king then?" "Yes, you are correct in saying that I'm a king. In fact, that's exactly why I came into the world, was to testify to that truth. And those who are ready for the truth will find it in me and in my words and in my mission. And those who aren't interested in the truth will be ultimately lost." And then we get to a famous question, right? If you could think about Pilate, some of the things he said, this is probably one of the ones that comes to your mind. What is truth? And I think for Pilate, I don't think he's asking Jesus some big philosophical question. I think it's just a throwaway line. But as readers of John's gospel, we're very interested in what the truth is, right? And John has already told us through Jesus in John chapter 14, when they're in the upper room, exactly what the truth is. In fact, we learn that the right question isn't what is truth, but who is truth. Because Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me." And so as readers of John's gospel, we know that there's a connection here. What is truth? Well, it's Jesus. Jesus is the truth. The truth is, the big picture is, that Jesus came into this world ready to serve, ready to give his life so that mankind could be reconciled with God. So at this point, Pilate's done. I don't see anything wrong here. And so he goes back out to the people, and he's like, this guy, he's innocent. He's not a threat. He's not going to do anything to anybody. And he says, I think he should just be let go. And so he invokes a common Passover tradition that he had where he would grant freedom to a prisoner of the people's choice. And Pilate thinks that the people are going to choose Jesus because clearly he's done nothing wrong. But the people shout that they want Barabbas instead. And I think there's some irony here too, because Barabbas, we often translate it as robber, like he was a robber. But that word can mean robber, but it can also mean revolutionary. And we learn in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that Barabbas had previously been involved in an insurrection against Rome. And so it's probably a better translation to say that he was a revolutionary or an insurrectionist. And that's who they wanted. That was more in line with what they thought their Messiah should be rather than what Jesus was doing. So at this point, Pilate has Jesus beaten around a little bit. He's going to get beaten a lot more later. But here he is mocked as a king. So we have this coronation ceremony. A coronation is the celebration of somebody being put on the throne. And so they pretend like Jesus is being put on the throne, and they mock him. They put a crown of thorns on his head. Okay, the crown of thorns was probably made of like dried date branches, which could have thorns up to like 11 or 12 inches long. I don't know that was what the case was here, but could have been. And they slammed this crown of thorns down on Jesus' head. They clothed him in purple. And the reason was because purple was associated with royalty. And the reason why is because in the ancient world, the only way that you could get the color of purple was to extract from this very rare sea snail. And so it was a very rare thing, so it was expensive. And it was associated then because of that with royalty. So they put him on the throne. They clothe him in purple. They slam a crown on his head. And they say, there's your king. Hail, King of the Jews. And they would go up to him and they would spit on him and they would strike Jesus in the face, all the while claiming, Hail, King of the Jews. All of this meant to deride Jesus. But the irony, as readers of John's gospel, we know the truth, right? We know who is the truth. Jesus is the truth, and Jesus really is the true king. So after this show of mock royalty, Pilate brings Jesus back out, and he says, I don't know what you want me to do. I can't charge this guy. This guy's done absolutely nothing wrong. And then he brings Jesus out, who's still clothed in purple, still has the crown of thorns on his head, which just makes them even angrier, when they see him dressed up as a king. And they say, we need to crucify him. So Pilate says, well, you do it then. You're so gung-ho on this, you do it. And they say to him, we can't do it. We don't have the authority to do it. You have to do it. And then here's where the real charge comes back. Okay, so they leave behind this he's going to take over thing. And they said, this guy committed blasphemy, don't you? This guy's claiming to be God. You can't let him off the hook. Now, this is new information for Pilate. Oh, you didn't tell me that before. And so he has to go back and interrogate Jesus one more time. We do know from other documents about Pilate that he was a very superstitious guy. And you can maybe see that here because we're told that when he heard that Jesus claimed to be God, he got afraid. And so he goes back to him and he says, where do you come from? And I don't think he's asking about his hometown. Hey, man, where'd you grow up? Did you, oh, I know Bob from there. No, that's not what he's trying to do. He's trying to ask him, are you really deity? Are you really God on earth? And at this point, Jesus, again, will not speak. He doesn't say anything. And so Pilate has to throw his weight around a little bit. Hey, you do know, I'm the one in control here. If you don't answer me, I can have you crucified. I have the power to save you or to kill you. Don't you know that? How does Jesus respond to that? Isn't that the crux of this whole thing? Who's in charge? And so Jesus answered, the only power you have has been given to you by God. The idea is that Jesus is the one that is in true power. He is the real king. Pilate goes back out and tries to set Jesus free one last time, but the Jews respond by saying, if you let this man go, you're no friend of Caesar. What an interesting thing to say to the Roman governor. And what an interesting thing for Jewish religious leaders to say. We have no king but Caesar. So in their zeal to stop a supposed theological error, blasphemy, they end up breaking a lot of God's laws themselves. They seem to be offering up a lot of theological error of their own. All right, so what can we learn? What is the big picture here? We learn that Jesus is the one that was in control this whole time. We learn that Jesus was here for a purpose and a reason. This was God's plan all along. This is why Jesus came to earth in the first place, was to give himself for the sins of the world. This trial was not an accident. It wasn't, Jesus ran afoul of the religious leaders, now what are we going to do? This was the plan of God, so that Jesus could once and for all deal with our greatest enemies, sin, death, and the devil. So what can we learn about the kingdom of God here? What does it mean for us today? First of all, we got to understand that God's kingdom is not of this world. You know, what happened with Peter last week when Jason was talking? He tried to cut off the ear of one of the servants, and Jesus said, no, this is not the plan. God didn't send me into the world to fight. God sent me to serve and to sacrifice. He stepped into history as God on earth to serve and to sacrifice. And later that evening, we saw it here. He's standing before Pilate, and Pilate asks him, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus has an interesting answer. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. In other words, Jesus is saying that, yes, he is a king. In fact, the word king appears 13 times in the verses that we just read. Only kings have kingdoms. But then he explains his kingdom is a spiritual kingdom, not a physical kingdom. He said that if his kingdom were an earthly kingdom, then yeah, his followers would fight, but his kingdom is from a different place. Jesus wasn't merely interested in a physical kingdom with borders. He was interested in a spiritual kingdom that spans the globe and the hearts of people who follow him. He was interested in paving the way for mankind to be reconciled with the holy God of the universe. But this still doesn't stop us today from thinking about Christianity in a very earthly way. You know, we need to make a Christian nation. You know, we need to make a moral people. You know, which sounds good, right? Yeah, we do want those kinds of things. But is that the way that Jesus told us to do it? You know, back in the Middle Ages, they tried that. It was called the Holy Roman Empire. And it began when Charlemagne took the throne in AD 800, and it went until Napoleon brought it to its knees in 1806. And the Holy Roman Empire was supposed to be holy, and it was supposed to be Christianity, and its leaders were supposed to be Christian leaders. But if you study the history of the Holy Roman Empire, it was anything but that. It wasn't about Jesus at all. It was about force. It was about power. And it's tempting. It's tempting to want to do the same thing today. But God's kingdom, we have to remember, is a spiritual kingdom. And its representation on earth right now is the church. It's you and I. And the church isn't located in any one nation over any other nation. The church spans the globe and the hearts of all believers who have put their faith in Jesus. The church has no border. The church has no fence. The church exists to point people to Jesus, and it spans the entirety of the globe. It's God's people, reigned over by Jesus. People gathered from every tribe and every tongue and every nation. Hearts here in Indiana, hearts all across the United States, and hearts in every part of the globe. And when Jesus returns, his kingdom will not be in one location, walled off from everybody else. He will be king of the entire world. Zechariah prophesies that his reign will be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. That's what we get to look forward to. And Jesus will rule with perfect righteousness, justice, and peace. Jesus has a far grander vision for his world than to rule over any one earthly nation. The second thing, we see God's kingdom is not of this world, but we also see that God's kingdom is ruled by King Jesus. So I have a question. Is it more dangerous to drive on a road that you've never been on before, or to drive on a road that you've driven on 1,000,000 times? Now, I'm going to argue that it's more dangerous to drive on a road that you've driven on so many times. Okay, we were once in Colorado, Shannon and I, and down by the Royal Gorge, and there's this road there just outside of Canyon City. And it's crazy. It's one of the top 10 most dangerous roads in the United States, like drop-offs on both sides. And so I said to Shannon, let's drive on that road. She's like, nope. She's like, you're not a good driver in the best of times. I'm not going to let you drive me on a road with cliffs on both sides. It's not going to happen. All right. But I think I would have been okay, right? And here's why. I would have known it's unfamiliar. I would have known it's dangerous. And so because of that, I would have been on high alert. Okay, when you drive on a road that you've been on millions of times, you might miss the one thing that's different that day. You've done that before, right? You get in your car and you're going to go to Walmart or you're going to go to church, but all of a sudden you're driving to work. Like, how did I start driving to work? Because you went on autopilot. And when you're on autopilot, you're not keeping your eyes on the big picture, and you might get yourself in trouble. And it's the same thing as we look at these final stories in the Gospel of John. Aaron, I know these stories. The trials, the crucifixion, the resurrection. We know these stories. If you grew up in the church, you probably heard them since you were this big. And every year we talk about them, especially on Good Fridays and Easter Sundays. We talk about these stories, but they can become so familiar that we miss how amazing these stories are. This passage, it's not fun to read. It's not fun to watch Jesus on trial. It's not fun to watch him get beaten. It's not fun to watch him get crucified. But all of this was on purpose. All of this was because God had a plan. All of this was for you. And we can't lose sight of that. Pilate, Annas, Caiaphas, Herod Antipas, they all thought they were in control. Not a single one of them was in control. Even in this trial, we see Jesus is the one who's asking a lot of the questions. He's the one taking the lead. He's the one making his captors stumble. Now is the time for the true king to be lifted up. If you remember back last fall, we were preaching in John 3 with Nicodemus. And if you remember, we were told there that Jesus had to be lifted up. Just like the serpent was lifted up. Remember that? We talked about snakes. And when the people had the plague and Moses lifted up the bronze serpent and he said, anybody who looks at the serpent will be healed. And now we're told that here's Jesus. He's in the process of being lifted up onto that cross. And those who look to Jesus will be healed. That's why he came. That's why he was here. That's why he endured these trials. King Jesus, lifted up on the cross. And John always has those things that work on two levels, right? And there's another one, right? He's lifted up onto the cross, and because he's lifted up onto the cross, he's also lifted up to the right hand of the Father, where now he reigns as king. And one day he will return, and he will reign over all of humanity in perfect righteousness, justice, and peace, bringing heaven to earth. So I want you to think about King Jesus today and worship him for who he is and what he did this last week of his life especially. If we do, I think we'll see these stories are a strong declaration of the love of God. Jesus came of his own free will, knowing this trial would happen, knowing that this crucifixion would happen. His arrival had a purpose, and it was not provoked by vanity or pride or, hey, look at me. It was provoked by love and humility, and he sacrificed himself. So God's kingdom is not of this world. It's ruled by King Jesus. And the final thing is it's led through humility and love. I mean, if we could talk about every leader, political leader throughout history, and we just put them into two camps. Here's are the ones that really cared about their subjects and did everything they could for them. And here are the ones who cared about themselves. Which group would be bigger? Okay, I'm not going to answer that question. I think most kings and rulers throughout history have cared far more about themselves than their subjects. Not so with King Jesus. With King Jesus, it was not about him. It's about us. It wasn't about bringing the sword. It was about making peace. Jason put it this way, right? It wasn't about the war horse. It was about the donkey. It wasn't about being served. It was about serving. Jason put it, the way of the basin and the towel. That's why Jesus came, and that's who he was, and that's how he led. And we are called to imitate him. He didn't force, he didn't coerce, he didn't push, he offered. How did he offer? Through the ultimate example of love, humility, and sacrifice. He put himself up on that cross. So I don't want us to get mission confusion. I think it's very, very easy to get mission confusion. We feel like it's our job to grab a hold of power and to force people to be moral. I think a lot of Christians see that as their job. That is not the mission that Jesus gave to us in Matthew chapter 28, Acts chapter 1. The mission that he gave to you and I was to make disciples of all nations. That's our job. And we do that by imitating the selflessness of Jesus. That means loving people so much that we make the gospel irresistible. You know, I have the very fun opportunity in a couple weeks to preach on slavery. Anybody want to take that job from me? No. But, you know, I came across this one passage when I was studying in Titus where it says that slaves are to obey their masters because in so doing they make the gospel attractive. Wow, that's an interesting way to put it. And isn't that exactly how Christians should live? We live in a way, when we live like Jesus and we live out his selfless values, you know, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. When we live that way, that's when we make the gospel irresistible. So we beat up on Judas, then we beat up on Peter. So I'm going to end by beating up on James and John. Okay, so James and John go to their mom. Mom, can you ask Jesus a question for us? And I think the reason they go through their mom is because they know Jesus might not respond very well to their question. And then they say to the mom, hey, can you ask him that when he comes again in his power and his glory, that we will be able to sit at his right hand and his left hand? What are they asking for? Power, authority. What does Jesus say when James and John's mother finally asks them this question? This is what he says. The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them then call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. That's a very important phrase there. You, not just James and John, but you, follower of Jesus, are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules should be like the servant. And then he told them, I am among you as one who serves. You see, Jesus didn't come from heaven and earth to use his position to exercise authority and power and to force people. Jesus came to serve. He came to seek and to save those who are lost. He came to meet our most basic needs, to be forgiven of sin and to conquer death. He came to lift us up out of the mire of our everyday lives. He came to minister to us, to serve us, to provide a way for us to be reconciled. And that's the mindset he wants built into his kingdom of God, the church. Pilate thought he had authority. Caiaphas thought he had authority. Rome thought they had authority. But when this trial was over, there's only one king that remained standing. And his crown was made of thorns, and his throne was a cross, and his victory came through sacrifice. The real king has stood up, and Jesus' kingdom will never end.